All right, today we're talking about European empires in the 19th century, or what is also known as the period of new imperialism. So we'll talk about why various European states embarked on a huge project of empire building at this point in history, how they were able to do that, which will connect to our previous lecture, and what that meant for world history. So starting out with definitions, just like we did with the Industrial Revolution. Imperialism is definitely a little more straightforward, but it's still good to think about what that word actually means. An economic and political system of control by an industrial power needing raw markets and materials. And that's very key. The Industrial Revolution, we talked about in the last lecture, is what allows Europeans to set about colonizing much of the rest of the world. But imperialism is also a little bit more complicated than that definition would have us believe. There are different kinds of imperialism. First, there's direct imperialism, or sometimes people call it formal imperialism. And this is where you march in with your army or sail in with your navy and you conquer that territory and say, this is ours now. This is sort of the traditional form of empire. This is what the Romans did. This is what the Mongols did. This is traditionally how we think about empire building. But you can also have indirect or informal imperialism, which is where you use economic and military power to force other states into conceding things to you that are good for you, not necessarily good for them. Sometimes this is just known as economic imperialism, and some people would actually argue that we are in a state of economic imperialism today, but that's something we'll talk about when we get to the end of the course. So with indirect imperialism, this means a country can use their force, but generally uses economic pressure to force another country into doing what they want. This kind of imperialism, you don't go in and set up a government. You don't go in and stick around. You use your economics or your military advantage to force this other country to do what you want. And usually that means conceding something economically. So again, this is kind of less well known, but certainly very important in terms of imperialism. Now, empire and empire building is not new to the 19th century, not by a long shot. I already mentioned the Romans and the Mongols. There are many, many others. But we will see that Europeans in the 19th century will really expand on a scale and scope that the world hadn't yet seen before. So here you have a map of the British Empire in 1815, so circa Napoleon. It's not that big yet, right? I mean, they've got a lot of Canada, but honestly, most of what they have of Canada is you can't live there. And they have half of Australia, same story there, and parts of India in terms of big holdings. But by the end of the 19th century, this will all change. By the end of the 19th century, the map, as we'll see on the next slide, looks quite different. And not just from the British. The French will begin spreading out. They'll take Algeria, Indochina, which is what is now Vietnam. The Dutch will take Java. The Germans will spread out, as we'll see. So what's different about this new imperialism are three things: the scale, the scope, and the industrialized power that make the whole thing possible. Between 1885 and 1914, 11 million square miles are added to European possessions. You can see on this map here, wildly different from 1815 to 1900. A lot more of the world is now gobbled up, especially Africa, but also Southeast Asia. This will be the largest imperial project in human history that anyone had ever set about before. Now, only 2 countries in Africa remain independent. Everything else will get gobbled up. The only 2 are Liberia, and they stay independent because Liberia had been established by freed slaves from the U.S. and the Caribbean in 1847. And they were nominally supported by the U.S. as a refuge, so the U.S. was not going to allow the British, the French, or the Germans to come in and rule it. So Liberia remains on its own, as does Ethiopia. Ethiopia managed to stay free of European control, mostly because they adopted Western technology. They also converted to Christianity, which made it a lot harder for the Europeans to argue that they needed to go in there and save the Ethiopians because they shared the same religion. Now, part of the reason why this will be possible in Africa is because those amazing, strong African kingdoms we talked about have by the mid-19th century weakened substantially. And so by the late 19th century, for the first time, Europeans are really able to go into the heart of Africa in a way they wouldn't have been able to do 75 years before. By 1914, 1/4 of the globe was ruled by the British Empire. That's huge. I mean, they had India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, plus parts of Africa, Southeast Asia. The British had 50 colonies and 350 million people they ruled over. That's compared to only 40 million people who live in Britain. I mean, this is huge. The British Empire was the largest empire in human history. So again, scale and scope, way bigger. The French also became a major colonial power. They also added colonies in Africa, as well as in Southeast Asia into Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And they ended up with 33 colonies, still staggering. You also see new powers begin to emerge and take part in this imperial process. The United States emerges as an imperial power in the Pacific Ocean, taking the Philippines as well as many other Pacific islands, as well as Hawaii. Japan is sort of a latecomer to the imperial game, but they will also stack on quite a few colonies. They will take control of Korea as well as Taiwan, and then later they will spread out, as you can see on the map in the lead up to World War II, throughout Southeast Asia. Now, by the late 19th century, many more states than just the British had gone through industrialization and adopted industrial technology. And this had, as you know, dramatically changed the speed of transportation by rail and by sea. It also changed the speed of communication with underwater cables and the telegraph. It also changed weaponry. Now you have weapons that can be manufactured in large numbers in factories that you can now take out and test against other groups of people who don't have that same weaponry. Now, why do the Europeans do this? They've got all this new technology, they've got all this ability. Why do they decide to take their show on the road and acquire colonies? Well, there are many reasons. The first reason is pure and simple profit. And this should be ringing a bell to our conversation about the Atlantic slave trade. The same thing's going on here. Just like the money that could be made off of sugar plantations and the slave trade that fueled colonization of the Americas also fuels this imperial endeavor in the 19th century. Because they were industrializing, that meant they needed a lot more raw materials, timber, cotton, rubber, etc. And they had to go looking for those items to make sure industrialization continued, because the more they produced industrial goods, the more money they could make. But now that Britain's not the top dog anymore, they have competition from other European nations, the US, Japan. And so now there's a real competitive market for these industrialized goods. And so they need to secure materials so they can try to stay on top. That's what everyone's hoping. But they also need to secure markets where they can sell their finished goods. It doesn't really help if you have all these textiles or whatever and you have no one to sell them to. There are only so many people in your home country. So by spreading out and colonizing, they're gaining resources to make more goods so that they can then turn around and sell those goods back to the colony. So the colonies are both a market and a place to get raw materials. Now, the second motivation is strategy. During the era of this new imperialism, expansion often occurred for strategic reasons, even if maybe there wasn't anything there that this other country wanted. So Britain was clearly the strongest industrial power for the first 6 to 7 decades of the 19th century. And as I mentioned before, they didn't really have any competitors until the late 19th century. But what happens is, as other European nations become more and more empires, they start to threaten British supremacy. And the British put a high premium on the crown jewel of their empire, which is India. And the British will go to great lengths to protect that from all the competition that they now are experiencing. Any route or location or colony that might impact Britain's hold on India or impact their trade with India was considered vitally strategically important to the British. So, how do you get from Britain to India in the 19th century? Well, you would sail down around Europe, Spain, then around Africa, and then over to India. It would take you a very long time. Well, after 1869, the Suez Canal is built. So that meant you went down around Europe through the Mediterranean and then down through the Suez Canal to India. And that would cut your trip significantly shorter. So what that means is they can make more money, right? The faster you get to India and back, the faster you get raw materials between the two, the faster you sell stuff. So the Suez Canal becomes critically important to the British. Now, the British at this point do not control Egypt, which is where the Suez Canal is. And what happens, and we'll see this in more detail in just a minute, but the British will become very concerned about instabilities in Egypt and whether or not they're going to lose control of the Suez Canal. And that will lead them into acquiring other colonies that, had it not been key to India, they probably wouldn't have taken. But the British will establish posts and a presence in Egypt, in the Middle East, as well as in South Africa, all to protect their connection to India. So they will oftentimes take stuff just to keep someone else from having it. And it's all about protecting that trade, protecting that money. So basically what this means is that Europeans begin claiming areas just because someone else might want them. I mean, this is literally like two kids playing in the sandbox. One kid puts a toy down, the other one takes it, and the first kid gets mad and takes it back. You want it just because someone else wants it. That's exactly what's going on here, only on a big, epic, and destructive scale. Now, they will also begin acquiring colonies because of events that are happening outside Europe. Sometimes it's not clearly about profit or strategy, sometimes it's about this other factor. And I'll give you 2 examples, and the first one is in Burma, which is today called Myanmar. Now, you might not think that modern-day Myanmar would be that important in the big scheme of these European agendas for empire. But as I said, the British were very interested in protecting India, especially since the French had claimed Vietnam. And you can see on the map how close geographically Vietnam, kind of tried to combine them there, Vietnam is to Myanmar. And then the French power in Vietnam was very concerning to the British, who became concerned that the French might want to take Myanmar. Now, the Myanmar king was very independent, and he did not want to be under the thumb of the British, nor did he want to be under the thumb of the French. And he kept getting pressured by the British economically and militarily to really give in to do what they wanted. And so he gets fed up and he kind of goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And he goes to the French and asks them for help, which the French send in 1883. They send troops and they're on their way to Myanmar. The British get wind and they become very concerned, as you might imagine. And so the British send in their own invasion force ahead of the French and claim Myanmar for themselves. So again, this is events that are going on in Myanmar and Vietnam, the British feel like their hand has been forced. But again, it's still about India. I mean, that's kind of the crazy thing here. Now, the next example I want to give you is Egypt, which I promised you a moment ago we'd talk about in more detail. Since the completion of the Suez Canal, both the British and the French were extremely involved in trying to informally control and influence Egyptian economics and politics. But the government of Egypt was clearly going bankrupt by the 1870s, and a large group of Egyptian nationalists were getting more and more upset about the state of their country, more and more upset about the fact that foreign powers seemed to have a lot of control. So by 1882, instability in the economy and politics were so severe that the British were afraid that there would be a takeover by these nationalists, and they thought these nationalists might then restrict British access to the Suez Canal, which is, again, their fast route to India, and they're going to be willing to do anything to protect it. So in that year, 1882, and much to the anger of the French, the British sent in an occupying force to Egypt. So in the end, this rush for territory in the period of new imperialism was caused by a combo of events in areas of interest, strategic concerns, and the desire for profit. And this all really has to do with this competition, which is perhaps best represented by the scramble for Africa. Africa gets carved up, as you saw on those earlier maps, not by Europeans necessarily going to Africa and surveying the land and dividing it up, which arguably they shouldn't have done anyhow. But what they do is they all meet in Berlin in Germany in 1885 at what's known as the Berlin Conference, because they've all realized that if they don't come together and carve up Africa as a conversation, that they might go to war with each other. So they meet in Berlin, they pull out a map of Africa, and they begin arguing over who gets what. And this is how they decide. That's as sort of superficial as it gets. They do not invite anyone from the entire continent of Africa. None of Africa's kings, tribal leaders, no one's invited. They do this entirely without the knowledge or acquiescence of the people who live on this continent. And they oftentimes divide up countries really arbitrarily, sometimes regardless of geography, deserts, mountains, jungles. They're really just literally drawing lines on a map. A lot of times they're creating countries that didn't exist before, and they're shoving various groups of people to live together that have centuries of hatred. This is really, really kind of the apex of high imperialism of the 19th century. Disregard for the people in the colonies. It's all about fighting between themselves as Europeans and getting the most out of this that they can. So now we're going to move to talking about how the Europeans justify what they're doing. Now, as we saw with the Atlantic slave trade, they began to justify trading human beings through the creation of racism by assuming that something about the color of your skin tells them something about who you are. And that will get ramped up during imperialism, because the Europeans, it's kind of hard to justify going in and taking over another region or country by just saying, well, we wanted it. That's not really going to rally the people in your country behind this cause. So they come up with two ways that they justify this, and the first is known as the civilizing mission. Now, the civilizing mission was the idea that conquest of these colonies was done for the benefit of the colonized people, to uplift and civilize the quote-unquote backward people of the world. What that means is that Europeans will say, well, look, all these other places, they're not industrialized. Therefore, they're backwards. They are less sophisticated and civilized than us, and it is our duty to go in and bring them civilization. As you can see, this is a very paternalistic and condescending viewpoint, but this is how Europeans will justify it. They'll actually cast themselves as the heroes in this story. Now, the civilizing mission does have very strong religious overtones. There was definitely prevalent arguments that it was their job to bring Christianity to other parts of the world. Most often this was Protestant churches rather than the Catholic Church. So this more often than not was Church of England, Presbyterian, etc., that would go on these mission trips to Africa, Southeast Asia, etc., to try to convert these people. And the belief was, as they argued at the time, was that if they could bring these, quote unquote backward peoples into quote unquote civilization, that it would not only save them in terms of Christianity, but it would also bring them into the economy of the empire. This is sort of, we'll make them more like us, and then they'll buy more of our stuff. Now, many of these Christian missionaries truly believed in what they were doing. Absolutely. But when you look at the documents of European governments and diplomats, they are more interested in the profit margin rather than the Christianizing. If Christianizing these people does lead to them buying more European products, then so much the better, is how they saw it. But this is, again, one of the ways that Europeans are justifying what they're doing. And this is known as the 3 C's of the civilizing mission: Christianity, commerce, and civilization. And as I said before, this is clearly an extremely condescending viewpoint, because the Europeans were automatically assuming that the people they were colonizing were somehow inferior to themselves and that they needed to be kind of completely changed. At the same time, the civilizing mission did leave at least a little marginal room for colonized people to actually take on European culture if they so chose to. And there was this belief amongst those who held the civilizing mission idea that if the colonized people adopted European manners and religion, that they could become European. Now, as we'll see, this is not the same with the second justification means that they used. Now, the second way that Europeans justified or tried to justify what they were doing was through something known as scientific racism. Now, this existed alongside the civilizing mission. Basically, scientific racism was a complex set of beliefs that asserted that a person's skin color and physical characteristics were the primary indicator of their inner characteristics. That your skin color, how big your head was, how long your arms were, that this would tell anyone looking at you how smart you were, how moral you were, all of those things. Now, the ideas of scientific racism held that these physical and inner characteristics were fixed and unchanging. That you can't change your skin color, therefore you can't change how smart you are. You can't change how good or evil you are. You can't change. You are fundamentally fixed by what you look like on the outside. So this is tapping into those already prevalent views about race. And again, as I said before, amping them up to justify what they're doing. And just like we saw with the Atlantic slave trade, which was all about profit, same exact thing here. Creating ways to justify terrible treatment of other people so that a certain group of people can get very, very wealthy. Now, these ideas had been around for a while, but were increasingly accepted and used as a justification for imperialism as the century wore on. Now, there are many reasons for this popularity, including Charles Darwin's 1859 book On the Origin of Species. I'm sure you've all heard of Darwin. Darwin is the guy who argued for survival of the fittest. That by looking in nature and animals, you can see that the strongest animals survive, and then they pass those good genes on to their children. So, survival of the fittest. Now, Darwin only applied this theory to animals. Darwin himself never talked about this with humans. But people read his book and extrapolated out and said, well, if this applies to animals, maybe it's true about humans. Also note, Darwin was not talking about the outside of an animal indicated their inner characteristics. But as I'm sure you all know, sometimes science gets used to purposes that it was never intended for, and that was definitely the case with Darwin. So people will take the idea of, this survival of the fittest, fighting against, other species, that Europeans will take that and say, well, all these different skin colors must mean we're actually different species. So they actually didn't think we were all humans, which is kind of bonkers when you think about it from a 2017 standpoint. And they said we must all be different species, therefore we are all fighting to be top dog. We Europeans have all this technology, all this industrialization, therefore we must be the best. So you can see how they get there, but it's flawed logic from the start to the finish. So again, they're taking Darwin's ideas and perverting them into something A, he never intended, but B, that's also not scientifically sound in any way, shape, or form. And so they will further sort of entrench the racism that developed in the Atlantic slave trade. And now they'll say, well, there's a reason why we're conquering all these other places. It's because we are the fittest in this equation. And I have it on the slide here, but it's because it bears repeating. This is further entrenching racism, which is a social construct. Remember, we talked about in that week 1. This is something human beings created to justify what they were doing. And now they're using it again to further justify what they're doing. Now, the end result was that by the late 19th century, it was acceptable and supported by quote-unquote scientists of the day to think of the people of the world as divided into a hierarchy of superior and inferior races. The superior races, to Europeans' thinking, were those that had risen, as they would have seen it, to positions of power, while inferior races they would have seen as those who had proven themselves to be weak. So again, this is how they're justifying it. We're conquering you, therefore we must be fundamentally and intrinsically better than you. Not just we have a better military. I mean, this goes much, much deeper than that. This is once again the Europeans justifying what they're doing, because it's very hard to justify to your people why you're conquering Aryans, spending a lot of money on the military, to just say we want it. You have to have a justifying reason, and this is one of the things they come up with. And they will put people into these hierarchies you see on the right, and even more complex ones. They will argue that a person's skull shape is important to, again, how smart you are, how moral you are. Now, of course, we know that's not true at all. Skull shape has nothing to do with how smart you are. But they will create whole branches of pseudoscience to support this. Here's another hierarchy, so you can see the Irishman on the left, the Englishman in the middle, and then the African on the right. And again, and in this one, the English are even saying, look, we're actually better than the Irish. So again, it's very complex the way they create this hierarchy. Now, the British in particular, but also Americans, other Europeans, will go out and photograph the peoples of their colonies, and they will assign them a visual type and say, oh, this person has this skull shape and their arms are this long, so they must be somewhat intelligent but prone to lying, or cunning and warlike, or immoral and deceptive. Again, things that don't make any sense to us in 2017, but there were people whose entire job was that. Absolutely just that. And people at the time, many of them believed that this was as solid of a science as Newtonian physics. It is not a science, for the record, but people at the time were happy to buy into this because it suited this imperial agenda they had all bought into. What all this means is that, in contrast to the civilizing mission, is that if you're not European, then you're stuck with your inferior existence forever. And that's what's displayed here in this Pear soap ad. The little African boy is bathing in Pear soap, and the bottom part of the ad is, you can kind of become like us, but never totally. I mean, this is kind of a terrifying ad, right? I mean, this is for soap. Pear soap has a ton. If you want more, Google it. They're absolutely just mind-blowing. But that was the message. Here, you can become almost European, but not quite, because you can never get past your skin color. Now, this will ultimately lead Europeans to believe even more in their superiority, and definitely will affect how they live when they go to the colonies. For instance, here we have some Dutch houses in what is now Jakarta around 1910. And this would have been done in British colonies and French colonies as well, where they would build homes and gardens and buildings that look like ones back home in Europe. And they would live away from the people they had colonized because they saw themselves as separate and above. So they're not mixing with these other people. They are usually employing these people as servants, as you can see in this picture, and again here. But that's about the most they're willing to interact. But again, they totally see this other group of people as inferior, and fundamentally so. Now, how might this affect you if you were one of these colonized peoples? Well, the experience as a colonized person would have varied depending upon what kind of colony you were in, what type of ruler you had, what your position in society was, whether you were male or female, amongst many other factors. Not all colonies were ruled exactly the same way. The biggest difference would have been between a directly ruled colony or indirectly ruled, which we talked about earlier. So if you were in a direct rule colony, where a conquering country establishes a government in the colony and imposes their laws on you, that would absolutely affect your life, right? Your ruler would change, your laws would change, everything would change. But if you were in an indirectly ruled nation where, let's say the British roll in and say, do what we want, but we're not going to stick around and leave a government, yes, that would impact your life, but not as much as if the British rolled in and stayed. Now, for instance, the Sultan of Selangor, which is in modern-day Malaysia, he maintained his title and his authority over his people, but he was forced to accept the direction of a British governor in the region who basically told the Sultan what to do. Oftentimes, rulers in these positions became figureheads with the real power exerted by the British. But it would have meant less impact on the daily lives of the people in Malaya. There's also a big difference if you were colonized depending upon if you lived in a settlement colony or a non-settlement colony. So a settlement colony would be like Australia, where the British send in a bunch of British citizens to set up cities and settle it, thus pushing the indigenous peoples off their land. A non-settlement colony is like India, where the British control it, but they do not send boatloads of British people to hang out there. If you lived in a settlement colony, like in Australia, as these Aboriginal children on the slide here did, this would have definitely made your life a lot harder because the Aboriginal peoples of Australia were pushed off of their land, much the same way Native Americans were in the United States, and forced to live on reservations. Australian Aboriginal children were oftentimes forcibly separated from their families, sent to a European-style school to try to make them more European, and most of the time those kids never saw their families ever again. So that's drastically different than if you live in India, a non-settlement colony, where the British are not coming over in boatloads. Your daily life definitely would have been affected, but not to the degree of, say, the Aboriginals in Australia. So there's no one experience of empire here. It's very much determined by several factors. But despite all these differences, there were some similarities in how people experienced being colonized by Europe. The first is that all people experienced a loss of political control at some level, as foreigners came in to replace or displace existing authorities. The second similarity is that many colonial peoples experienced the transition to colonial rule as one of violence. Very few areas surrendered their territory without a fight. And even after conquest, colonial powers found it necessary to continue to use violence just to maintain control. So this meant the use of military force against not just leaders of these territories, but also against civilians as well. So this is rarely a peaceful or smooth transition. The third similarity was that all colonial peoples, whether under direct or indirect, settlement or non-settlement, experienced economic transformations. This was because the universal imposition by the colonists of taxes on the people they just colonized, whether those are property taxes, consumption taxes, etc., you have new taxes to pay. Even when villagers had never seen a European, their lives still changed because they had to pay these new taxes. And what do you need to pay taxes? Cash. A lot of the places that were being colonized were places that had a barter economy. This is a goat for 2 sacks of flour. You can't pay your taxes to the British in sacks of flour. So in order to get cash, you either have to sell something or you have to sell your labor. And because of the need to do this, more people were brought into the global markets for these products that the Europeans are selling. This also meant a lot of people had to give up their family farms and things like that to go work for the British or the French in order to have money to pay their taxes. So it fundamentally changes the economies in these colonies. The fourth similarity is that all people in colonies experience new ideas, new forms of social organization, new laws. So many new things are coming in. And the last similarity is that nearly all colonial authorities picked favorite groups to help them rule. And they would say, oh, this group is more white than the rest, so therefore we'll give them all the good jobs and give them preferential treatment. What this means in the long run is that in the 20th century, when European powers leave Africa and Southeast Asia, they've now left decades of anger and bitterness over one group getting treated better than the other. And in some cases, this has led to all-out violence, specifically in the Rwandan genocide in 1994, where when the Belgians were in Rwanda, they had picked out the Tutsi people as superior. So they got all the jobs and the power. And in 1994, the Hutus, the group who had been sidelined, killed about 800,000 Tutsis in 100 days. I mean, that's decades and decades and decades of animosity that built up and exploded in this horrifying way. Now, the worst case scenario of being in a European colony was in the Belgian Congo. Now, from 1890 to 1911, this was the personal colony of the King of Belgium, King Leopold. All he wanted out of it was money. And specifically, the Congo was rich in rubber, something that you desperately need for industrializing, for, all the machine parts. Now we're getting into the era of cars. You obviously need rubber for for tires rather. So this is very lucrative. And Leopold didn't much care how they got the rubber. He just wanted as much of it to make as high a profit as possible. Now again, this is his personal colony. This is not managed by the Belgian government. And the desire for profit led to rubber extraction policies that were hideous. There were quotas for how much rubber you had to produce. And if you didn't get that much, they would cut off one of your hands. They would go kidnap your family and hold them hostage until you extracted enough rubber for the day, for the week, etc. Sometimes they would cut off the hand of your wife or your child. I mean, this is absolutely brutal. Now, they would never cut off both hands because they needed you to have at least one hand to continue working. Sometimes they would even smoke a person's hand after they cut it off to preserve it, to show around, to dissuade other people from not making their quota. In total, 10 million people of the Congo died in this 21-year period because of these horrible extraction policies. The people working on these rubber extraction plants were brutal, not just in cutting off hands, but they would definitely kill people, kill your family, if you were not, as they saw it, towing the line. So incredibly brutal. Ultimately, some of the first pieces of investigative journalism print stories on this, make this evident. The Belgian government takes the Congo away from King Leopold. They do not make it its own independent nation, but now it is ruled by the Belgian government, and they end all these horrible practices at least. Now, not all colonial regimes were as brutal as the Congo, but all empires have their own stories of murder, massacre, and the misuse of power. So yes, the Belgian story is the worst of it, but the British are no saints, neither the French, the Dutch, etc. Nobody comes out of this without some pretty black marks on their history. Now, all of this will have important legacies for world history, but it's important at this point to remember all of this is motivated by profit, just like the Atlantic slave trade. All these imperial powers do terrible things, and that's not to say that we should let them off the hook. I'm just saying, again, the Belgians had a bad situation, but the British and the French, etc., also did. And most importantly, to keep remembering that the concept of racial difference is a social construct. It is not inherent to the human experience. And in fact, it is relatively new in the human experience. Remember, we talked about comes about during the Atlantic slave trade. And then now in the 19th century, Europeans doubled down on this concept of racial difference because it helps them justify what they're doing so they can make more money. So it is absolutely connected to what we talked about in week 1.